Okay, welcome to Bright Videos News for Monday, July 27th, 2026. I'm Mike Adams. Thank you for joining me today. And over the last few days, I did a number of interesting interviews. I'll be running a couple of them today, at least a couple. So first of all, let's see. I think it was Thursday. Yeah, Thursday I was on with the son of Alex Jones, Rex Jones, who is quite a bright, independent broadcaster in his own right. And I was on with him as he was hosting the War Room show for, 25 minutes or so, talking about consciousness and AI and simulation theory and much more. So I'm going to play that for you today. Also want to let you know he invited me back because tomorrow, Tuesday, he's hosting the full Alex Jones show, and I'll be on, or currently scheduled to be on with him live for the third hour of the show, which is at 1 p.m. Central Time. If you want to catch that, you can follow, Real Alex Jones on X, or I think it's alexjoneslive.com, or the Alex Jones channel on Rumble will also carry that live. And I think we're talking about the surveillance state, the flock cameras and drone surveillance and everything else, and the role of data centers in processing all the surveillance. But I'm not sure. Things can change very quickly with rescheduling and so on, breaking news. So it's not guaranteed for sure that I'll be on the show, but that's currently scheduled. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Also today, I'm running my interview with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. And I interviewed with Daniel Davis also last Thursday about, details about the famine situation. And by the famine situation, I mean the global famine that's coming in 2027 and beyond. And explaining on that show, and by the way, I'm a fan of Daniel Davis and his channel. It's a very popular channel on on YouTube called Deep Dive, but he's also on X. He wanted me on to describe the reality of the situation with the fertilizer shortages, how much food scarcity will actually happen, because right now in America, there's nobody starving to death. So a lot of people are like, well, this is not a big deal. What are you talking about? Well, just wait. just hold on, because there's a long pipeline for fertilizer and growing seasons and agriculture and crop yields and so on. It's a long pipeline. It's a pipeline spanning at least 2 growing seasons, in other words. So the effects of this are going to be felt in 2027 and 28, etc. So that's coming. And it's very clear that the Strait of Hormuz is never going back to what it was. We've even had a video released by Iran's deputy speaker, I think his name is Ali Nikzad, saying that the Strait of Hormuz will, quote, never return to pre-war conditions. Never. Yeah, well, I predicted the same thing. From here forward, Iran will assert control over the strait. There's just no way around that. So that also means that we're not going back to the fertilizer outflows and the natural gas outflows and urea and ammonia and helium and sulfuric acid and everything else and oil, that we saw last year. We're not going back to that. Not anytime soon. Probably not for years to come. And even then, it's going to be under the control of Iran. So I'll be playing that interview for you here today. And then I want to tell you, this week I might have more of an abbreviated schedule for a very important reason. It's because I'm working on a really critical new program. It's about a 12-hour program, or at least it's 12 chapters. And I've been recording the program. So far, I've recorded only 3 chapters out of 12. So I have a lot more to do. And I'm going to be recording that this week because this program, I know this is going to sound like hyperbole, but it's the single most important program that I've ever recorded, and I think you'll see that it may be the most important course that you've ever watched or listened to. And it's going to be free, by the way. We'll be running it on brightu.com coming up in a little less than 2 weeks. But I have to really focus and get that thing done. And also, I'm conducting a bunch of interviews this week. So time is short. And one of the reasons why this course is so critical is because you'll see that the information that it's presenting is absolutely life-saving in the aftermath of any nuclear detonation. So if we start to have radiation fallout, potentially billions of people could die. Because, and I've mentioned this before, because of the DNA repair mechanism in their bodies has been compromised by the spike protein from the vaccines and vaccine shedding. And that's all by design, I believe. And potentially 5 billion people could die from even low levels of increased background radiation. So I've finished all the research on this, and I have the solution for, and whether you took the vaccine or not, whether you've been exposed to spike protein or not. I mean, I've been exposed to it. People shed on me. They probably shed on you too, right? Whether you've taken the vaccine or not, and it can show you how to upgrade your DNA repair mechanisms to survive not just the spike protein, but to survive radiation fallout. So again, I think this is the most important course I've ever done, and I really need to focus on that this week. So I ask for your forgiveness if my broadcasts are shorter this week. That's why I'm working on this course. I have to finish it by the end of this coming weekend. And I will. And again, the course will be free. You'll be able to watch it at brightu.com coming up here in about 2 weeks. So I'll keep you posted on that. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also did an interview with Maria Z Media. And so I think I'll play that one for you tomorrow. Yeah, that's probably what I'll do. By the way, economist Dave Collum, who I've invited onto my show, he's a frequent guest on Coffee and a Mic with Michael Ferris and other shows. Dave saw my interview with Daniel Davis, and Dave actually posted on X. He said, "This is a well-reasoned explanation of the coming famine." So pretty high praise, actually. Because I think Dave Collum is also, I think he's a chemist by education. I think he is. And I cover some chemistry, the creation of nitrogenous fertilizers and the Haber-Bosch process, how we take atmospheric nitrogen and then turn it into ammonia and make it available to plant roots, things like that. So there's a little bit of chemistry in there. And apparently I didn't screw any of that up, or I would have heard from Dave, I think. It's just like, your chemistry. Also, finally, before I wrap up this intro here, and then I'm going to get into some reports with you, I want to mention that, that letter, or kind of a petition appeal letter that was sent to the White House. I think maybe it was Friday, from all these tech companies, including NVIDIA, and Jensen Huang came out and said, we support open source AI, or really what's called open weights AI, but those terms are used interchangeably for the most part. Open source, open weights, they don't exactly mean the same thing, but people use them that way. And then, believe it or not, over the weekend, even Google came out and I think reluctantly signed the letter. Let's see, who else signed it? Well, a lot of companies, a lot of AI companies, obviously Hugging Face, etc. Olama signed it. AMD signed it because that makes perfect sense. AMD is making these really great unified memory computing platforms, Strix Halo and others, that will be released soon, and they'll offer something like 192 gigabytes of unified RAM for LLM inference. And then I know they're coming out with 256 gigs of unified RAM. That's going to be great. I can't wait to buy that. So AMD will benefit from open source AI, but the crux of the letter to the White House was that if Trump if you outlaw open source AI, then you're going to crush U.S. corporations. You're going to destroy the economy, and you're going to crush all the startups because everybody's using open source AI. And previous to that, there was this agenda pushed by the White House that open source AI is communism, because the best models are Chinese. Even though the Chinese people don't even consider themselves communist, by the way. China is not a communist country, right? It's a socialist country. Vietnam is a communist country. China is a socialist country. Anyway, the White House was trying to convince everybody that open source AI was communist, and the backlash against it was severe. So we'll see what happens. But there's one company that has not signed the letter. Well, a few, but Anthropic, notably, has not signed it because Anthropic is run by a bunch of spineless weenies. One of them named Dario. And also Apple didn't sign it, and Oracle didn't sign it, and Amazon has not signed it. So it kind of tells you who's evil, doesn't it? The most evil refused to sign. And we're not saying that everything has to be open source. We're just saying don't outlaw open source AI. And I posted on X, I said, hey, I'm a Texan. If you ban open source AI, we have a saying in Texas, and it is, come and take it. Come and take it. It was made famous from Gonzales, Texas, where a museum there that I visited has a replica cannon. And it was the cannon that the Texans were saying, come and take it. Because there was a demand that they surrender, surrender and give us your cannon. And it was like, come and take it, bitches, And that's the attitude in Texas, and that's my attitude to the White House. You're going to outlaw open source AI? Come and freaking take it. Yeah, good luck with that. Because, we're going to continue to download and share and post and modify and do, fine-tuning training and everything on open source models. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Nothing. And if you try to stop it, you'll just make America stupid. You'll just crush the economy, crush the startups, crush the corporations, raise costs, and then all the models would have to be approved by the government, so they would be retarded, heavily censored, guardrailed models that are basically useless, and nobody would use them, and everybody would just change their IP address through a VPN and download models like Quen and, DeepSeek and all these models from China, because those are the ones that work. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But we might all be like LLM, smugglers like Han Solo pretty soon. We might have to smuggle language models into the country. And you might get arrested for having knowledge that's unapproved by the White House, that kind of thing. That's how crazy things are getting. So anyway, that's kind of a summary of what's going on right now. I've got some special reports for you here, followed by those interviews that I mentioned. And also reminding you that one way to prepare yourself for all the chaos that's coming is to check out our sponsor's website, the Satellite Phone Store, sat123.com, where they have not just satellite phones, but also Faraday bags, pouches for mobile devices, larger bags for laptops and things. Even they have really large bags for generators and workstation computers and things. Yeah, they have those. Lots of other things, plus solar generators. Solar generators with solar panels. They've got different packages available, so it's good for off-grid survival. Check it out at sat123.com and enjoy the rest of the show. Okay, big picture time here. Welcome to this special report. I'm Mike Adams. Big picture about what's happening in the world. Why are there so many wars? Why are supply chains cratering? Why is the Strait of Hormuz closed? Why are there economic sanctions against countries that don't do what we command them to do? What's going on? I want to step back and just explain in the big picture here what this really is. It's a global war for American empire total domination. This is an endgame total domination strategy to control what my friend Michael Yan calls routes and resources. If you control the routes and resources, you control the world. What are the routes? Specifically the sea routes, although there are land alternatives in some cases, such as what China's building, the Belt and Road Initiative. But for the most part, cargo and commodities and energy moves by sea because that's the most cost efficient by a couple of orders of magnitude, it turns out. So moving commodities and resources and energy by sea is very economical, but only if the routes are open. What are those routes? Well, think about the choke points, right? It's the choke points. It's the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, which hopefully everybody is familiar with now that the Houthis are bombing Saudi Arabia's ships, leaving the ports there on the west side or the southwest side. The choke points are the Strait of Hormuz, obviously, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca. There are other choke points on the planet, but those are the most important ones, of course. Well, the Strait of Gibraltar is another. All very important areas, and if ships are not able to pass through those choke points, then all of a sudden moving energy and commodities and food and fertilizer and everything becomes ridiculously expensive. So routes and resources. Whoever controls the routes ultimately controls the resources. And what Trump is trying to do, and I believe it will fail, by the way, he is trying to reassert total global dominance by the United States of America, the American empire, by choking off the other countries that won't bow down to our demands, and specifically choking off China. A big part of this is choking off China. Now, economic sanctions have been used for decades to try to choke off countries like Iran or Russia, for that matter. But sanctions have also been deployed against China, and tariffs are deployed against, almost everybody. It's a form of punishment, even against U.S. allies like Japan and Italy and Taiwan, etc. It's crazy. But that's what empires do. They get crazy and then they demand payment. They demand obedience from the whole world. Well, the grip of the U.S. empire was slipping over the last couple of decades. Dollar losing its value, the power of the U.S. military losing its reputation and competency. So when Trump got in office, he decided that he was going to run around the world and bomb everybody into obedience, and he was going to seize control over all the routes and resources that mattered, including, overthrowing Venezuela, for example, and bombing everybody else into submission, expanding the war against Russia, destroying Russia's oil refining capabilities and transport capabilities, transport ships, oil export, etc. And then also trying to conquer Iran. And Trump believed that if he could do those things, then he could effectively cut off China from food and energy and other resources, and also then with economic weaponization, cut off China from international trade, which is kind of a silly idea given that China makes everything. So, of course, everybody wants to trade with China. Otherwise, where are you going to get your electric cars from, and your batteries and your robots and your drones and everything else, your telecom equipment, your solar panels. I mean, come on. Everybody wants to trade with China. So this was a gross miscalculation by Trump. But he still believes it. He still thinks that if he can destroy the energy routes in particular, that China will collapse from within. I think that's a faulty assumption. It's not really working, is it? Now, the currency, the dollar, has been, of course, weaponized against the rest of the world. And as I've said before, the primary role of the U.S. Navy is to enforce dollar hegemony. That is, to threaten all the countries around the world that if you don't use the dollar to buy and sell goods, specifically oil or other forms of energy, if you don't use the dollar, we will bomb your nation into oblivion and we will kill you. And this is, ask Gaddafi. Oh, wait, they killed him. They bombed Libya into economic oblivion. Same thing with Saddam Hussein. Same thing they're trying to do to Iran right now, but they're failing. But they're trying it with Russia too. It's the same strategy. It's always the same. Do what we say, use the dollar, or we will bomb you, we will assassinate you, we will destroy you, we will sanction you, etc. And that's the whole strategy right there in a nutshell. It's all about routes and resources. It has nothing to do with protecting the people of Iran from their own government. That's just a stupid cover story. And it doesn't really have anything to do with Iran getting a nuclear weapon, other than the fact that if Iran had nukes, then Iran would be able to assert more control over the Strait of Hormuz, obviously, and the entire Persian Gulf region. So it's not the nuclear weapons themselves that are really the fear of the U.S. It's the fear of Iran having leverage to control routes and resources. That's the issue. Especially Iran then being able to credibly threaten Saudi Arabia, let's say, or Qatar, or UAE, or what have you. So Trump's gambit, though, is failing. And it's failing miserably. And what's actually happening is the entire world is learning that the U.S. military has run out of munitions, or very nearly so. This was just reported by the New York Times, by the way. Trump and his military leaders, they deny it. They say, oh, we have plenty of weapons, but they don't. Because we hardly manufacture any munitions or missiles or, cruise missiles, Tomahawks or drones or bombs or whatever. We just don't manufacture that much. But we've been burning through it, bombing through it at a record pace, and it's almost gone. So the U.S. military doesn't have an unlimited supply of munitions or interceptors for the Patriot missiles or, HIMARS munitions and things like that. We don't have an unlimited supply. And it's going to take years for the U.S. to rebuild what it has already used up in bombing Iran. And even that bombing hasn't worked because Iran has not capitulated. They haven't suffered regime change. And for some reason, all that bombing didn't turn over the Strait of Hormuz to the control of the United States for some reason. Maybe it's because you can't bomb geography into compliance. You can throw all the bombs you want at mountains. They're still mountains. They're still there. So it's not working. And in fact, it's showing the world that the U.S. military is weak. It's a paper tiger, like I reported, months ago, if not more than a year ago. The Navy, what is it able to accomplish? Aircraft carriers are sitting ducks, giant floating targets. The Air Force can drop bombs, but those bombs don't cause the target country to surrender. And they don't destroy Iran's capabilities to launch its own drones or missiles or rockets in retaliation, because all those weapons are deep underground, far beyond the reach of U.S. weapons. So the credibility of the U.S. military has plummeted under Trump, and so has the credibility of the U.S. dollar. So this is why the entire world, or the rest of the world, other than maybe, the UK or some other close U.S. allies like the Five Eyes countries, Australia, etc., the rest of the world is moving away from the dollar. They don't want to use the dollar if they don't have to. They are developing their own domestic weapon systems based on what Iran has proven is effective. In other words, drones and a bunch of short-range missiles, but autonomous drones are really the key now to modern warfare, clearly. And then, thirdly, they are asserting control, these other nations, they're asserting control over their local waterways as much as they can, because they recognize that's the key, that's the ace card that they have, that's the value that they have given to them by God through geography. So if you're a country like Yemen and you have groups like the Houthis and you're just sitting right there, right next to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait there at the mouth of the Red Sea, you're like, wait a second. this is a very valuable piece of real estate here. This is a choke point for the world. Something like 60% of the world's commodities traffic sails through there on its way through the Red Sea up to the Suez Canal. So if you can assert control over that one choke point, wow, you actually have a lot of leverage. That's called an ace card right there. And that's why the Houthis are asserting that control right now. That's why Lloyd's of London, which is one of the largest ship insurers in the world, just announced they will no longer insure Saudi ships that are sailing through the Red Sea. I wonder why. Maybe because they keep sploding? Maybe because they're on fire? So no insurance means, you probably don't sail. No insurance means, you have to risk your own ship being totally destroyed, which is a very high risk right now. If you're the Saudis and you're trying to get oil out of those ports, the Yanbu port in particular, you're going to get targeted. So things are changing dramatically in the world right now. This dynamic is changing. The U.S. no longer has the clear dominance in terms of military might. You can rest assured that China has noticed, and so has Russia. The U.S. cannot be trusted in terms of its currency. Hence the development of trade settlement systems that will be partially backed by gold. In particular, what China is working on with the Shanghai Gold Exchange and the BRICS nations. I understand that's taking longer to develop than maybe it should have, but it's still underway, and it's still a clear priority. And then on top of that, many nations are taking active steps to become more domestically self-reliant, so that if trade is shut off, they have redundancy at home. Russia is a great example of this. So Russia has its own steel industry, for example. Russia can mine the iron ore. Russia has a very mature mining industry for all kinds of things, including phosphate ore and aluminum and lots of things. And then it has a very mature steel industry, much more so than the U.S. by far, not even close. Russia can produce its own steel and make its own tanks or weapons or cruise missiles or, whatever, hypersonic missiles. That's all sourced domestically on purpose because Russia realized years ago that it could not rely on, fair trade or free trade in the world because the United States would always weaponize trade sanctions against Russia. So Russia became a lot more self-reliant. Same thing with Iran. And same thing is happening with China. In particular, China knows that its vulnerability is its dependence on energy imports. So yes, China imports a lot of energy from the Persian Gulf. And yes, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is hurting China's, supply chain. That's probably why China had stored over 1 billion barrels of oil domestically. But more importantly, what China is actually doing domestically is they are diversifying their energy sources. China's solar industry has exploded. I think there's more solar capacity installed in China than in any other country in the world. I might want to fact check that, but I'm pretty confident that's true. China has enormous hydropower facilities, such as the Three Gorges Dam, and they're building a new project that will even dwarf that. China has massive wind farms on top of, the coal power plants, etc. So China can actually survive longer without oil than almost any other country. When you add to that the fact that now I think it's 60% of new vehicle sales in China, consumer vehicles, are EVs, which means that those people don't need oil. They don't need gasoline. They don't need diesel. They just plug it in. They can charge their car off the grid. And China has a very abundant power grid with cheap, affordable electricity, something like 8 cents per kilowatt hour for consumers. or maybe it's 8.5 cents, but that's cheap. That's affordable electricity, compared to what the Europeans are paying or even what Americans are paying, especially on the East Coast areas. I mean, the PJM power grid there, some places are paying like 30 cents a kilowatt hour, and it's going to go higher. So China's way ahead of everybody else in the world on this. They know that they have a vulnerability of energy importation reliance, and they are diversifying. That's one reason they're not panicking over this war in the Middle East, because China knows that they can survive a multi-year supply shock on oil. They can survive it. Now, the other thing is food. China imports a lot of food from all over the world, including typically from the United States. And China can't grow enough food currently to feed its own people. But you know what could change that almost overnight? Robotics. So imagine agricultural robots with indoor vertical farming. Yeah, it uses a lot of power. You need the artificial lights, you need the cooling systems, and you need to charge the robots. But if you can automate farming in indoor farm systems that can be set up in the cities, you can feed 1.4 billion people domestically. Now, you're not going to be feeding them, hamburgers and pork ribs and, all the meats that tend to come from other countries, or at least are augmented by that. But you're also not going to have 1.4 billion people starving. You're going to have some kind of food that can be produced domestically, even if it's indoors, as long as you have abundant energy and you have robotics automation. Well, who's the leader in robotics? China. Who's the leader in battery storage technology and battery chemistry in the world? China. Who's the leader in, automated forklifts that automate the movement of goods in warehouses? China? Yeah. I could go on, right? China. They're the leader in all these areas and much more, which means that China's dependence on food imports, that's a challenge that will be solved through automation and innovation. It'll be solved in the next decade. And then the whole energy reliance is also going to be solved, because China is building its own massive domestic energy production centers and also shifting its energy to, away from fossil fuels and into kilowatt hours, for example. So again, China's ahead of the rest of the world on this issue, which means it's going to be very difficult for Trump to try to put a stranglehold on China by trying to cut off their oil. What's really happening is he's causing a diesel shortage in America, a jet fuel shortage in America, higher food prices because of higher agricultural prices due to higher diesel prices and higher or more diesel scarcity, and also causing farmers in North America to have insufficient supplies of fertilizer for the fall planting season that's coming up. So Trump's trying to put a chokehold on China. Actually, what Trump is doing is making himself and the GOP extremely unpopular because of rising food prices, rising fuel prices, inflation getting worse, dollar devaluation accelerating, and the American people becoming increasingly unhappy and even hungry in many cases. That's what's actually happening. While U.S. allies like the UK end up also in a severe energy scarcity scenario for the approaching winter. How cold is it going to be, in Paris or London or Berlin or wherever? It's going to be cold because they're not going to have much energy at all for the winter. Clearly. It's going to be cold. Because America blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and, no Russian gas for you, That's the situation. So really, this plan of global dominance of routes and resources, this plan is backfiring. It's making America look weak and incompetent. And it's actually showing the world that America can no longer credibly threaten even Iran. A nation that's less than 1/3 the size, more like 1/4 the size of the U.S. in terms of population. And what the world is learning is that the U.S. doesn't dominate the leading technology anymore. The U.S. doesn't have the most advanced drones or robots or advanced materials or rare earth minerals extraction technology or manufacturing automation or automobiles or battery technology or any of, 1,000 other things that we could name. The U.S. doesn't have the leadership anymore. U.S. still has good leadership in rocketry. That's one thing, SpaceX, rockets. There's a couple of things that the U.S. is pretty good at. Rockets is one of them. And also GMOs and biotechnology and building biological weapons to kill people. The U.S. is really good at those things. So it's like, if you want to fly to Mars or kill a bunch of people, hey, the U.S. is where you want to get your tech. But if you want to make the world a better place through better technology and green energy and solar power and off-grid storage systems and automation of farming, all that stuff comes out of China. The U.S. is good at building weapons and things that kill people and things that commit genocide and bombs that destroy apartment buildings and hospitals. China's good at building things that help people build things, to build civilization. You see the difference? It's becoming quite obvious at this point. So the U.S. just looks weak and desperate at this point, and the currency looks weak, even though I know you're going to say, well, the dollar's stronger than all the other currency. Yeah, the dollar's stronger against other currencies. The dollar's weaker against groceries. And that's what people need to buy. Groceries and gas and health insurance and housing and a new pair of tennis shoes. The dollar's weaker against all those things, which just means that the other currencies around the world are falling faster than the dollar, making the dollar look a little bit more valuable in comparison. But all the currencies are falling effectively. That's the trend line. And what is it in Korea? What is that, the won? And I hear people quoting prices in Korea. They're like, the Uber ride, it costs like 15,000 won. I'm like, man, that sounds expensive. And then they're like, that's like $4. Oh, so what the hell happened to the won, man? Seems like your won lost. You lost all the value. I think I have that currency correct. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the won. And then, Philippines is the same thing. It's like, how bad is your currency? Oh, well, I went to lunch, cost me like 20,000 pesos. What? Well, how much is that in dollars? Now, I'm saying this as a joke. I don't know the actual conversion rate, but it's like $8 or whatever. It's like, geez, do you guys carry around wheelbarrows of currency all day, or you just have a lot of zeros on all the bills? What does that tell you? Most of the currencies in the world are going to zero, and so is the dollar. It's just a question of how long it takes to get there, really. Anyway, you get the idea, okay? So all these wars that you are witnessing, which is really all just one big war, okay? It's a war of the U.S. empire versus China, ultimately. And it's a war for global dominance and control over routes and resources, for the most part. There are little sub-wars, like who's going to control technology such as AI. That is another little battlefield space. Who's going to control, satellites and orbital technology, etc. But the big war is who's going to control routes and resources. And once you understand that, everything else makes total sense. Like, what's really happening? Why is NATO allowing Ukraine to bomb Russian oil refineries? To create scarcity of resources, obviously. Which also will hurt China. That's all by design. Why is the Strait of Hormuz still closed? Because Trump and the globalists and the Zionists, they want it closed. They don't want it open. They want to create more scarcity, more of a supply shock. Also because the fertilizer, so there's more famine, more people die off next year. That's all by design, folks. And this is a last-ditch, desperate, final war for the future of planet Earth. And it looks like the American empire is losing. And that's probably a good thing in the sense that we don't want one giant evil empire to run everything. We would rather have a more balanced world, a multipolar world, where America is one of several key players. And yes, I want America to do well, but not by bombing and assassinating and slaughtering and committing genocide in the world. I want America to do well by innovating and manufacturing and creating and trading and, creating good things. That's what America used to be known for. And the only way to do that is to get along with the other players in the world. You got to get along with Russia and Iran and Brazil and China. You got to get along with them. Which means you can't just bomb everybody into submission. You can't just weaponize all the tariffs and all the sanctions. You can't just use your currency as a financial weapon of mass destruction, in other words. So the U.S. has to learn that lesson. And Trump, being the bullheaded narcissist that he is, he's very slow to learn this lesson. He still thinks that he could win because in his mind, he's living in the 1980s, I think, or maybe the early 1990s. He thinks this is Operation Desert Storm, where, we kicked ass and there was no resistance. Yeah. Well, those days are long gone. Long gone. So Trump's going to have to learn this lesson the hard way through a defeat. And then once the American empire learns that lesson, then we can step back and say, okay, how do we actually interact with the world in a way that respects the right of other nations to exist? See, that's not even part of, Marco Rubio's vocabulary at the State Department. The U.S. State Department doesn't believe that any other nation has any right to exist unless we grant them that permission, and they can only exist if they bow down to us. I mean, where do you think Zelensky came from in Ukraine? He's a total creature of the U.S. CIA policies and Victoria Nuland and the revolution and everything from 2014, the takeover of Ukraine as a proxy state to harass and destroy Russia, to try to overthrow Russia, take their resources. That's what the whole thing was about. Same game plan with Venezuela, which seems to have worked, which probably caused Trump to think he could do it again in Iran, and then that did not work. Didn't work at all. And, oh, by the way, the bigger plan was then to defeat Iran in like 1 week, I guess, and then from that, go defeat China, cut off China, cut off all the fuel and all the fertilizer and food from China and block all the South China Sea, and then use Taiwan as a proxy nation to harass China and probably get Japan in on this too, use all the military bases in Japan. And that whole plan didn't work because we got stuck trying to defeat Iran. So eventually the U.S. is going to have to learn this lesson, going to have to step back and say, I guess we can't really just rule the world like, an emperor and demand total obedience from all these other countries. I guess we're going to have to actually get along with other nations. Oh, the horror, the thought of having to get along. Oh my God, that's an alien concept to the White House and the State Department. That just feels wrong to them, It's like fingernails on a chalkboard. Like, get along. Ah! I mean, you listen to Marco Rubio speak, it's obvious in his words, he's never even considered the idea that the U.S. would have to operate as one sovereign nation in a world of other sovereign nations that have an equal right to exist. That thought has never entered his mind. Same thing with Hegseth. Same thing with Trump. But that's all about to be recalibrated. And Iran is now saying, the Strait of Hormuz is permanently ours and it's never going back to the way it was in 2025. And I believe they are correct about that. So there's going to have to be a recalibration in the minds of the American empire, hegemons, the lunatics in the White House and the State Department that think that we rule the world. This recalibration is going to be very humbling. And they're going to resist it in every way possible. They're going to just try to fight and fight and fight until they have run out of options. They've already run out of munitions very nearly. They're about to run out of all options. They've run out of political support for the most part. midterm elections are coming up in the U.S. in November. That's not that far away. So the U.S. is going to fight and fight and fight until it just can't fight anymore. And then at some point, it's going to have to realize, okay, we have to change the way that we deal with the world, I suppose. That day's coming, but it may not come right away. So be prepared for the turmoil, the chaos, the supply chain collapse, the mass starvation, the diesel rationing, perhaps, the higher prices on food, the loss of fertilizer, reduced crop yields, all of these things. These are side effects of this desperate war for total global control that Trump is waging. Frankly, it's a war against humanity. And Trump seemingly doesn't care how many millions of other people die in this process as long as the U.S. gains control, but it's going to fail. And sadly, probably millions of people will die from famine during this process of the U.S. being taught a whole new lesson in humility. That's just unavoidable, it seems. What you can do, obviously, is you can beef up your own preparedness. You can be ready for this. You can survive this. You can be more resilient. And that's what I teach every single day. That's what I do, right? And that's what probably you have done a lot of these things. You're more resilient. You're more decentralized. You're more off-grid already. You have backup food supplies. Probably you have backup medicine, or you know how to make some of your own medicine also, or grow it. You know these things, and this is what I teach. So if you want to make it through this chaotic time, which is a time of total desperation of the American empire it's going to lose, it's going to be humbled, it's going to have to recalibrate, then listen to my podcast, and I'll do my best to keep you informed and give you practical solutions, things that you can do to make it through all of this. You can hear me at brightvideos.com. You can purchase our long-term, storable, high-end, lab-tested, certified organic food supplies, including freeze-dried fruits, all organic, and much more at healthrangerstore.com. You can read my articles at naturalnews.com, or you can follow me on X at healthranger. I also have a Substack called Health Ranger, and I'm on brighteon.social at healthranger. So check it out on any of those channels, and I will be bringing you a lot of practical information about self-reliance, sustainability, food, medicine, backup monetary systems, which is pretty much precious metals and other hard assets. And I'll be bringing you the best information I can to help you navigate all of this, because this is going to be a multi-year process. It won't be concluded overnight. We have to be prepared for years of war and years of supply shock. So very few people are ready for that. But you can be ready. I'm ready. I'm as ready as anyone, I suppose. More ready than most. But we can make it through. So that's the silver lining. All right, thanks for listening. Mike Adams here. And remember, check more of my videos and interviews at brightvideos.com. Take care. Let me share a little simple piece of wisdom with you here. And this is a post I put out on social media. It seemed to resonate with a lot of people, so I'll read it for you. Am I the only one who still wears a simple analog watch with a canvas strap and no Bluetooth or surveillance features at all? Because, for God's sake, I don't wear a watch to have it spy on me. If I want to know how many steps I took today, I just take a moment and assess how my feet feel. If they feel tired, I've taken way more than 20,000 steps. If I want to know my heart rate, I just put 2 fingers on my carotid artery and I count for a few seconds. If I want to know whether I'm sleeping well, I ask myself how energetic I feel when I wake up. You don't need fancy tech to monitor you all day long. Check in with your own body from time to time, because it tells you everything you need to know. Instead of wasting money on a smart watch, in other words, you could just be a smart person instead. And that's free.
Because of so many things are happening with the United States war with Iran and trying to find out how much we're going to expand and what may be coming next. Those are all pertinent questions. But in my view, there is a bigger issue that is not getting anywhere near enough exposure. And it could be far, far more important than just whether there's a war with Iran or how it may get solved, or even the cost of oil. And that is the ramifications of what this war may mean in ways that not very many people are thinking about. But fortunately, there is one person who's thinking about it, and we have him on our show today. We are very delighted to have back again Mike Adams, also known as the Health Ranger, is founder of all Brighton platforms. BrightonVideos.com is where you'll find some of his information there. He's also an AI developer and a #1 bestselling author of Food Forensics. Mike, we're really glad to have you back today.
Thank you, Daniel. It's always great to be on your show. I'm a fan of your work as well, so I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you very much. And it's kind of one of those odd situations where I'm really glad to have you on today, but it's going to be a pretty sobering show here. But we've got some information I think people need to know, because this war has to get over with much more than just what people may think. Just because war itself is bad and it needs to be over, especially when it's not having any positive impact. But this one especially is in a much bigger situation here. And just to kind of to set the stage for what we're going to talk about here, probably the two key issues here is, #1, the Strait of Hormuz remains shut. No matter what I don't know why they do this. To see U.S. Central Command keeps on posting things. President Trump periodically posts that the strait is open and traffic is fine. And it never is when you look at what's actually going through. And now that it's even more complicated because the Houthis out in the Yemen and in the Red Sea area have shut off the Bab al-Mandab. And so now then, and they've already attacked Saudi shipping already early in this process, which really underscored that and caused the price of oil to go up. And that got a lot of people's attention. But as something you have published a few days ago got my attention even more than that. This is this article you wrote called "Trump's War on Iran is a War on Global Food Security, and Here's the Math to Prove It." And that really got my attention here, because the article opens up by saying the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, and the mainstream media is treating this as a geopolitical story about oil price and naval posturing. They are missing the real story, the coming famine. So can you just, first of all, tell us what prompted you to write this story, and what do you mean by the coming famine? You didn't write the possible coming famine.
Yeah, it's baked in at this point. So let me just establish a little bit of background in case your viewers don't know my background, known as the Health Ranger. And I run a mass spec food laboratory, a very large lab in Central Texas. I'm the founder, and I'm a published food scientist. And also my company, Health Ranger Store, imports food from all over the world, and then we test it in our own lab. That's kind of what we're known for. But we are very much aware of food supply chains and international providers of food, and some of the stresses on the system that are happening right now, delays, crop failures as they occur. We will know about them ahead of everybody else, or I should say ahead of retail consumers.
Yeah.
So and I'm an AI developer, so I unleashed a bunch of AI agents the other day to do some research on this. And I was asking the question, what % of the total world fertilizer production actually comes out of the Persian Gulf? Now, if you just consider the seaborne traded fertilizer, that's about 30%. But compared to the total fertilizer of the world, which feeds about 4 billion people, or half the human population, the amount that comes out of the Persian Gulf is, according to my research, from 8 to 12%. So I just went with a 10% number because that's right in the middle, easy to work with. So if you say that 10% of half the world's population depends on the Strait of Hormuz in order to be able to eat because of the fertilizer outputs, and we can talk about how nitrogen, how ammonia is produced from the Haber-Bosch process, which uses natural gas for reasons involving chemistry. We can get into that if you want, but the result is that really 400 million people in the world are at risk of famine because of the continued failure of this war, of Trump's war on Iran. And importantly, Daniel, those 400 million people are largely not located in the United States or Canada or the UK or other typical Western nations. Those 400 million people tend to be located in what we would call the global South. So that represents about 5% of the human population that will be facing food scarcity. And not all 400 million people are suddenly going to have nothing to eat. There will be food redistribution. There will be social pressures. There will be sort of shared famine where a much larger number of people will have a lot less to eat. And the ramifications of this are dire, one of those being mass human migration to the north. So what Trump is actually unleashing, as much as he says he's trying to stop, illegal migration into the United States, he's actually unleashing global conditions that will lead to massive, what Michael Young calls human osmotic pressure. People leaving countries like Bangladesh or India or Yemen or Somalia or maybe even, Egypt in some cases, and countries in Central and South America, looking for wealthier nations where they won't starve to death. So we need to talk about, and I think that's why you had me on, we need to talk about what this is going to unleash in terms of the social implications.
Yeah, and I do. I actually want to start with that. You mentioned the Haber-Bosch process, which we have on the screen here, because you say it is not some obscure industrial footnote. It is the single most important chemical reaction for human survival. Can you explain to us a little bit so we have some idea what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So Haber-Bosch describes a process where you take atmospheric nitrogen, and remember the atmosphere is about 79% nitrogen, but it's bound up tightly as N2, so it's nitrogen and nitrogen. And plants ordinarily can't access that nitrogen from the air because it's bound up. So you have to separate the nitrogen and you have to form a nitrogen compound, which is ammonia. NH3 is one of the easiest to produce from this process. But in order to do that, you have to subject atmospheric nitrogen to hundreds of atmospheres of pressure and extremely high heat. And the only way to do that is to use an abundant economical form of energy, such as natural gas. So gas that comes out of the Persian Gulf, or previously that came out of Russia and went into Germany before the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, the German company BASF used to manufacture a large volume of ammonia and then downstream products such as urea or various nitrogenous fertilizers. And the gas that comes out of the Gulf, some of that gas is consumed right there in the Haber-Bosch process in the various facilities that surround the Persian Gulf region in order to export things like ammonia or urea or nitrogenous fertilizers, which is a completely separate path from phosphate-based fertilizers, which uses sulfuric acid that comes out of the oil. We could talk about that separately. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is our world today has built an infrastructure over the last, let's say, 70 years or so that supports the feeding of 8 billion people, whereas about half of those 8 billion people are only able to eat because of Haber-Bosch. So that's why it's the single most important chemical process that keeps humanity alive as we know it today.
And I wanted to ask you about that. So how long has that been in effect? Because my understanding is that the only reason we can have 8 billion people is because prior to this, the food supply wouldn't support that many people. So that was one of the reasons there weren't more. But now that we have it, we can support more, but only as long as we have it. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So if the infrastructure of creating synthetic fertilizers shrinks or contracts, then the world population will have to contract to reach homeostasis with the available infrastructure. Now, before Haber-Bosch, which they were German scientists, and I think it was around the 1917 or so, and then there was it was development over a few decades. But this came out of German innovation, World War I and World War II era. Okay, and the German scientists, Berlin was the centerpiece of scientific genius in many areas, chemistry and physics at the time. And this process was necessary because the world was running out of fertilizer, because before that they were literally scraping like bird poop off of islands to feed the British people, to fertilize the crops to feed the British people. Or they were using manure, right? So you can take a lot of farmland and you can use horse manure and what have you, cow manure, it's a messy business, but you can grow some amount of food, but you can't grow enough food to feed 8 billion people. So if we have to go back to the animal manure days or the bird poop days, and pretty much most of the bird poop was already harvested, taken off the islands, then our world population may only support 2 billion people, maybe 4 billion if we're lucky, right? And that's why it's said that synthetic fertilizer feeds half the world's population. That's a pretty conservative number. Some other economists would say, no, we're going to collapse down to 2 billion.
So help people understand, because if those who are not scientists in this arena may think, well, hang on. I mean, okay, so you don't have as many fertilizers. We'll use something else, but we have the farmland, and we can still keep growing stuff on the farmland. But you're saying it's not a matter of the acreage that you can farm, but it's this other thing. How does that manifest physically on a crop?
Well, yeah, right. It's the acreage will only produce crops based on the inputs. Especially when that same land has been used for many, many years, it doesn't have any natural fertilizer in it anymore. And, you have to add the inputs, N, P, and K, right? But, if you go back to ancient Egypt or, Roman times, et cetera, like the River Nile, they depended on the flooding of the river to bring fresh nutrients in. And then you would have record crops the year after the flood. So flooding was a natural process to redistribute trace minerals, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. That was natural fertilizer. If you didn't have the flood, you didn't have the crop yields. Same thing is true today, except we've built a population that needs enough food, that needs synthetic fertilizers in order to function. So if the Persian Gulf stops functioning, we lose about 10% of the global fertilizer production, which puts, like I said, about 5% of the current human population at extreme risk of food scarcity.
Now, that leads into one of the next points you make in here is the delayed time bomb. So whereas with oil and the price of oil, as we saw during the time of the signing of the MOU in June, is it had an immediate reaction, and the price of oil dropped actually precipitously, probably more than the fundamentals would allow. But nevertheless, it did that. But you're saying that this is not that way, and that this is the delayed time bomb to 2027 and 28 will be catastrophic. Can you explain why that is?
Yes, because of growing and harvesting seasons, and the fact that right now in America, for example, we are eating food that was planted last year in many cases. Some of it was grown and harvested last year in 2025. Some of it's being harvested now from the spring crops, and in the spring here in North America, most farmers were able to get the fertilizer they wanted because the war wasn't, we were just barely into the war at that time in the February, March, April planting seasons in North America. The shortages hadn't yet really kicked in. But all of that changes in the fall for the Northern Hemisphere. And you look at crop planting seasons from Europe, Middle East, Southeast Asia, China, Russia, North America. The planting seasons are, different depending on your geography and climate. But the fall planting seasons are going to be especially difficult. Fertilizer prices are much higher, and fertilizer scarcity will be a factor. Now, I'm not saying that the whole world's going to starve. I've been very clear. There's going to be about 5% of the world's population that will essentially have no access to food. But I'm not saying it's 100%. It's 5%. But the pressures from that will not be felt until the result of the fall planting season and the harvest that follow, which in some countries the harvest begin in like November or December. But in 2027 is when things really kick off. That's when we're going to really see the shortages. And Daniel, the thing that's going to make it far worse is that diesel scarcity will be a factor in North America at the same time. So you're going to have much higher diesel prices, and transportation is a major cost component of food and farming and agriculture. I mean, I own tractors. I live on a ranch. Those tractors burn diesel, a lot of diesel. They're just gulping diesel all day long. If that diesel price goes up, food prices go up. That doesn't even consider transportation. That's just a farming operation. So North Americans aren't going to be facing mass starvation. They're not going to be eating each other like cannibals, but they're going to face much higher prices in the grocery stores and much lower supply, which means less choice and shelves that aren't stocked as deeply as they are today. That's what we'll face in America.
And let's keep it on America for the moment. If the war magically ends tomorrow and the Strait starts to open back up, the Bab el-Mandab opens up, there's no evidence that's going to happen. So whatever this day happens will be some hypothetical place later into the future. But let's say that it did. If that's the case, how much trouble of the kind you're talking about in North America is already baked in, and how much will this opening now relieve that?
One growing season, roughly, is already baked in. So what are we, 5 months into the war, give or take? So roughly that's one growing season. That's already baked in. It's already done. We will face food scarcity. We will face food inflation. We will face a fertilizer crisis, no matter what. If this continues for another, let's say 6 months or to the end of this year, that's when things become really catastrophic on a global basis. So, think about it. Societies can redistribute a certain amount of food for a period of time, but you can't lose calories forever and keep all the people alive. At some point, you begin to suffer, so much famine and die-offs, immune systems are compromised, etc. That's going to start appearing in 2027. So my prediction is that you'll see, the IMF or the UN or food aid organizations really putting out the call for emergency food supplies, emergency fundraising beginning in the spring of 2027. And throughout the summer of 27, one of the main stories that we will be seeing, no doubt you'll be covering it, is the food panic in these other countries and the mass human migration that's setting off, which is going to create all kinds of cost pressures and societal pressures across Western Europe, for example, or even in the United States, because there's going to be this massive migration wave from the South.
So where do you project because you say only 5% of the population, and people are thinking, okay, it's a big globe, 8 billion people, but you're saying it's not generally dispersed around the globe, but it's going to be localized in some places that are especially vulnerable, which I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's where this migration would originate from. Where are those countries that you're most concerned about?
Yeah, you're correct. So some of those countries are Bangladesh, India to some extent. I mentioned Somalia, Nigeria, Yemen, and in Central and South America, especially in South America, there are countries where there's already a lot of food scarcity pressure. And if you look at, like UN organizations right now, or the WHO, they will tell you right now where there are countries that are on the edge. For example, every year, Somalia has, millions of people on the edge of starvation. And without food aid, those people wouldn't make it in a normal year. In 2027, that pressure is going to be so much worse that I'm not even sure that there's enough international food aid to go around because, think about the United States. We're going to be suffering reduced crop yields, not mass starvation, but there's not going to be this great abundance of low-cost crops to just send to the rest of the world. What will be the political will and the economic will of the Trump administration to save people in Somalia with extra food supplies? Probably that's not at the top of the White House list, I would imagine. So the saving of people with food supplies, even if you think China might step in and try to help people that are hungry in, Pakistan or India or wherever, well, China can't grow enough food to feed its own people in a normal year either. China imports a massive amount of soybeans and rice and whatever, and wheat from the rest of the world. So there's no giant strategic food reserve like there's a strategic petroleum reserve that can take us through 2027, 2028. It doesn't exist. There are small food reserves, but just like the oil reserves, they're beginning to be drawn down and they're going to run out.
And so with these countries where it's going to be, they're going to be the hardest hit because there's not going to be, we're going to be already in a scarcity time and a high price. So we're not going to have a lot of extra to send out. Presumably that's going to be the case in Europe as well. What you mentioned earlier that you have some concerns about migration, forced migration. What is that going to look like? And we'll just start off here in the United States because obviously that's a big, huge political hot potato right now about ICE and all that kind of stuff. What is going to happen if you add to it by people coming in even more than they had before?
Well, there will be just a massive amount of pressure wherever famine gets very bad. Then people will voluntarily leave to seek survival in what they perceive as a wealthier country, which tends to be countries more to the north. So there will be people in the Middle East. Oh, well, let's start with Africa. People are going to, sail across, and they're going to go right into Morocco and Spain, and ultimately Italy and Greece and wherever. The European right now, a lot of European countries are concerned about so-called invasions from sub-Saharan Africa or parts of the Middle East. That's going to be so much worse because of the famine. And then, what about hungry people in India? The government currently subsidizes fertilizer across India to make food affordable. It's very difficult to feed 1.3 billion people, or maybe that number is higher now, especially in a global scarcity scenario. So you're going to see migration. You're going to see people trying to, even Southeast Asia, they may try to get into China, where they perceive there's more food in China. Russia is actually relatively well positioned compared to most other countries because Russia is more self-reliant and self-contained. Russia has its own fertilizer phosphate production, and it has its own very mature agricultural system. Plus, the Russian people have a mindset of preparedness and being ready for harsh winters in much of Russia, obviously. So Russia's probably going to be the best in all of this. The United States is going to suffer a lot of migration pressure, and there's going to be a lot of domestic unhappiness because of the unaffordability of food for Americans who vote. So one of the things that I think is going to hit the GOP very sharply, not just in the coming midterms, but probably in 2028, is that Trump will be blamed, I think, for causing these global conditions that make food unaffordable and also energy and fuel much more expensive for those who can afford it. So there's quite a social backlash coming in America.
And what about China? You talked about Russia. What would China? You've talked a little bit about India too. They're obviously quite large. How are they going to be stacked up since they're a definite net importer of all petroleum products? How does that work on their agriculture?
Well, China has a lot of foresight, so of course they have massive petroleum reserves. They have been drawing those down, but they're nowhere near emergency levels like we're approaching in the United States. Same thing with food. So China has stockpiled a massive amount of wheat and soy and rice, and they will be eating into those supplies. China's probably better positioned than almost any other country other than Russia in order to survive this. But eventually, China will either have to pay higher prices to outbid food supplies from countries that are producing it. And that's going to get difficult because the energy shock will reduce yields, and the fertilizer shock will reduce yields in countries that are net producers and exporters of food. And on top of that, the United States, China depends on the U.S. for a lot of food exports, and all of those crops and crop yields are going to be affected in the U.S. as well. So China, of course, has a top-down control system. China's not known for having, grassroots riots. China's not going to have probably, an angry popular revolt or anything like that. But they will spread the suffering if necessary across the people, and the people will endure. So, China's going to make it through, but a lot of Western countries may face social upheaval.
Yeah,
that's my prediction.
A lot of these the ways we've been operating and the expectation and the sense of entitlement that we've had, I think, is not going to do well for us when scarcity hits just by itself. I feel we're going to learn that.
The other thing, if you don't mind pointing out, Daniel, the fact that food will become more scarce and far more expensive makes home food production much more lucrative. Whereas before, when people would home garden, you could spend a fortune. You could grow the world's most expensive tomatoes, right? That were way more expensive than what you could buy in the grocery store. But all of these factors that you and I are discussing are going to turn that upside down, and there will be a resurgence of victory gardens, as we used to talk about in this country back in the World War II era. Victory gardens, which is the decentralization.
We're going to get, let's just go ahead and get to it now since we're talking about, there's some other things I'm about to talk about. But I know one of the things that I guess one of your companies do, or one of your services is that you help people figure out how can they ride these things out, and whether it's emergency supplies or whatever. What can, from now, if people recognize what's coming, maybe even in a year from now, already baked in, much less if the war goes on through the end of the year, what can people do right now to ride this out more effectively later?
Okay, sure. Well, and if you don't mind, my main video site is brightvideos.com. That's where people can follow me, and I put a lot of how-to information there. But one of the main things people can do is start composting today, because compost, I call it black gold. Compost needs to age. You need the microbiological activity. That is actually food potential. So if you can, compost kitchen scraps or whatever, and start building a compost pile, you'll need it in 2027 because it'll help you grow more effectively. The second thing you can do is you can actually go to a feed store right now and you can purchase fertilizer. It's more expensive than it was 6 months ago, but you can still get it. And 6 months later, you may not be able to get it at all, right?
Any price, yeah.
So stockpile fertilizer, not so much that they think you're Timothy McVeigh,
Right.
Right.
Yeah, you do want to avoid that.
Yeah, but enough that you can explain, yeah, this is for food production, right? Because that's kind of if you could say a white gold, right? A white gold, because most of the nitrogen fertilizer is white in color, pelletized. That's like a battery for food production, and that's going to have tremendous value in the days ahead. And then, of course, you need garden seeds that are heirloom seeds. I always recommend non-GMO heirloom seeds so you can save the seeds generation after generation. And the thing is, Daniel, we all come from our pioneering parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who lived this. They did this all the time. And we need to remember that knowledge. We need to remember what our grandparents taught us. And that's going to be life-saving knowledge right now, because you don't need to grow all your own food to survive this. But if you could supplement your food with 20% of things you grow yourself, you'll save a fortune compared to what food is going to cost in the grocery store. And you'll also have higher nutritional density, which will improve your health. And plus, gardening it's good for your health to, get your hands in the dirt, get outside and grow some food. It's a healthy.
Well, you are,
activity.
after all, the health ranger. So
yes,
that's good advice.
Yeah. And I grow some of my own food as well. I encourage everybody to do that. And there's also a whole area of harvesting wild foods, because there's so many wild foods that grow around. And I'm not even talking about hunting, that, some people will do that, but just harvesting wild foods. Like on my ranch in Texas, we have wild hogs that are digging up wild onions all the time. But I've also got acorns. And if you know how to just harvest and treat acorns, you have to get the tannins out, which is a simple process. Then you can make acorn pancakes. You can have acorn flour and acorn pancakes. I know how to live off the land more than most people, and there are other experts who know more than I do. So we won't starve, but
and are
not
those
everybody has that
on your site somewhere?
Yeah.
If anybody wants to know how to do those.
Oh yeah, I mean, these are common themes that I talk. I guess I don't have one video in particular that focuses on it, but these are the themes that I cover on a regular basis at brightvideos.com.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Gary's showing it on the screen right there. Okay, so let's go back to your article here, because this is a separate issue that I think is really important. The moral reckoning. This is a war against the human race. It's not simply a war against Iran, you have written. It's a war against the world's most vulnerable populations who have no stake in this conflict. The question is not whether this famine will happen. It's whether we will allow it to happen. Trump's actions risk killing more innocents than any conflict since World War II, simply because the math does not lie. Can you expand on that a little bit? Yeah,
so thank you for bringing this up. The moral component here it really needs to be considered for history. The number of people who could die from this conflict could actually exceed the Holocaust of World War II. And importantly, and that is if it continues, right? If this conflict ends tomorrow, it's not going to be that bad. But if it continues, it could easily exceed that. We could be looking at tens of millions of deaths over the next couple of years from famine alone. And the majority of those deaths will occur outside the region of the war. So we're not talking about even Iranians dying or Americans or Israelis dying in these numbers. We're talking about people in Bangladesh. We're talking about Africans dying. We're talking about Somalians dying, right? Or South Americans. And this is something that I don't think the White House is sufficiently considering, right? They have their very narrow focus, like, we can't let Iran have nuclear weapons. Well, okay, but is it worth killing 30 million people who live somewhere else around the world for you to try to achieve that goal, which is probably not achievable anyway? The cost of this is in human lives outside the battle zone. And it's not America's bombs that will kill the most people. It's the lack of food. And almost no one's talking about that. So that's why I'm really glad you're having me on, because this is a critical, this is a humanitarian question at this point. This war is a war against humanity.
Right. Yeah. And that is why, when I saw your article, that's why I felt that it was really important, because there are second and third order effects that just hardly anybody besides you and a couple of others you mentioned a second ago we're talking about. And we need to get this word out there so that people understand the urgency of getting this war over with. Yes. And that kind of led into your last part here, which you said you wrote just earlier this month. The global population of more than 8 billion people depends on a fragile web of natural gas, oil, and downstream chemistry that took 60 plus years to build. If we lose 25% of these critical inputs, the system collapses. The only path to avoid this famine is to end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And then, therefore, now the Bab el-Mandab immediately. Nothing else will work. That's what really kind of stood out to me, is that if we keep going on, 25% of these critical inputs, the system collapses. Explain how that works, because one may think, okay, well, 25% is terrible, but that means 75% is fine. And how does the whole system collapse if that 25% goes down?
Well, because of the reliance on things like sulfuric acid for creating phosphate fertilizers, right? So, of course, the sour crude oil that comes out of places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, the sulfur is removed during processing. That sulfur becomes the feedstock input to create sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is used to pull the phosphorus out of phosphate rock ore. That phosphorus goes into the agriculture industry. By the way, there's another pipeline where high grade, high purity phosphorus goes into lithium iron phosphate batteries, or LFP batteries, that are powering, the power grid, grid shifting from wind and solar technology. So my point is, if you lose the oil, you lose the sulfur. You lose the sulfur, you lose the sulfuric acid abundance. You lose that, you lose phosphate fertilizer abundance, and so on. So these things begin to stack up. And by the way, if you lose the Red Sea, and I know you've covered this, Daniel, if you lose the Red Sea, you lose something like 60% of global shipping of these elements. If they take an alternate route, then you add, another 3 or 4 weeks to the time, and then you have another delay in the system. So the system, we are living on a just-in-time global system of food and fertilizer and natural gas and sulfuric acid and oil, and all of these things are intertwined in a way that creates a just-in-time system where the average human being can't live more than 45 days without food. So what happens if you have a 50-day gap? That person's dead. See, you can't just tell humans, I'll just wait 180 days. The food's coming after the war's over. Just sit around and fast for 6 months. That's not going to work, right? So we are fragile beings in a world of interdependency that is being fractured by this war. And on top of that, in my opinion, it's a senseless effort for the U.S. to try to seize control over the Strait of Hormuz because of geography. God gave the Strait of Hormuz to Iran. Bombing to try to take the strait back is like trying to go to war against geography, and that's just not going to work.
It is not, and we are proving that it's not. And it's always been insane when Trump said, "Oh, I'm just going to take over this, and I'm going to charge 20% fee." That was always fantasy, because
not going to work.
Thousands of miles away, and they're on it. But and obviously that happened. I mean, that didn't happen because it became evident within days, and so you don't hear or hadn't heard him talk about that for more time. Listen, this is really important, because it sounds to me like, by the way, if I can understand from what you've said, this just-in-time system, this very intricate system that keeps 8 billion people alive, works okay if there's no war. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. It works okay if the Suez Canal is open, Strait of Hormuz is open, the Strait of Malacca is open, Strait of Gibraltar is open, and the Panama Canal is open. And if everything's working, right, then we're fine. And that's the normalcy bias that people are now living on, and they're assuming that the future is going to be like the past because that's all they've experienced. I can assure you, and you've had experts on like Dr. Chris Martenson who confirmed this, I can assure you the future will not be like 2025. It's not even a prediction. It's a projection of what has already happened. Okay, so this crisis has already happened. Now it's just working its way through the supply chain, and it's a 5-month problem right now. It's survivable. It's not the end of the world if we get to peace now. If this becomes a 10-month problem or a 2-year problem, then the situation becomes catastrophic, not just for the economics and industry of human civilization, but for the survival of the total human population as it exists today. And I don't want to have to come on your show, Daniel, and talk about why we've lost 100 million people, because that would be a travesty, and it's completely avoidable.
And that's why this last part, the only path to avoid this famine is to end the war and reopen the straits. Nothing else will work. And so it doesn't matter almost any of these other geopolitical things or arrogance and egos of various leaders. It matters to get the strait open so the system can get back in. And it's going to take some time. And what is your estimate, by the way, that say that rational thought returns to a lot of these people? They recognize this. Maybe they watched your show here recently. They read one of your articles. They said, oh, crap, we better get this thing over with right now. And Monday morning, the thing is over with. Everybody opens up all their straits and passageways, et cetera. How long do you project that it would take the system to unwind and get back into where it was functioning the way it was on the 27th of February?
Well, it would be way beyond the end of this calendar year. No question about it. I actually don't think that we will ever see the Persian Gulf return to the same outflows that we had in January of this year. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I mean, just some of the oil wells will never produce the same flow that they previously did. And then, shipping insurance. What about ship crews? Who's going to sign up? Yeah, sign me up. I'm going to get on a ship and go into the Persian Gulf when there might be a peace agreement. Who's going to do that, right? I don't think, I'm not trying to black pill everybody here, but I don't think it ever returns to what it was. Will there be some flows out of it? Yes, absolutely. Does Qatar have an incentive to get all of its natural gas production trains back online? Yes, but even they said that's a 3 to 5 year timeline to repair the two trains that were destroyed. 3 to 5 years, Daniel. And that right now, that's a 17% loss of their natural gas production.
That's a big hit.
So, that's in their press release. Okay, so these aren't numbers that I'm making up. And again, Dr. Martenson can give you even more detail about oil and some of the other experts you've had on. And you have a lot of great experts who are on and who are desperately calling for peace for some of the same reasons that we're talking about here today. This is no longer a war between 2 or 3 nations. This is a war for humanity. All of humanity is at some level of risk because of this ongoing conflict. And in my opinion, Trump and Hegseth need to leave the region. Find a way to declare victory. Some people will buy it anyway. It doesn't matter. Just declare victory. Leave. Let the strait open. Let Iran charge an environmental fee of $1 million a ship. At least we won't lose tens of millions of people.
Yeah, that's what I've been arguing really from the beginning of this war, that the walkaway plan, as we call it, even now, as ugly as it would be politically for President Trump, is for mankind is desperately needed. They can play whatever they want with word games, but we got to get this stuff physically open so that these vulnerable people themselves don't suffer harm, and then cause cascading effects for America and Western Europe, where this is where they're going to go if they can't eat. It's not hard to figure that out. You
understand this because you're a good person, Daniel, and you have compassion for fellow human beings. And I've watched your show for a long time, and what I share with you is that we have a fundamental love for fellow human beings. We don't hold in our hearts some automatic hatred towards people because of their religion or because of their nationality. We don't just hate Russians for being Russian. We don't just hate Chinese for being Chinese. We don't hate practitioners of Islam for practicing Islam. We believe that all human beings have a right to exist and have a right to access food. Indeed. And we understand that scarcity is artificially engineered.
Right.
Whereas God and Mother Nature give us this natural abundance, but humankind comes along and interferes with it, and then humanity pays the price.
And boy, I appreciate you coming on today, and we will support all of your work because we're definitely working in tandem on that one, so that we can avoid some of these worst outcomes. And God help us if we keep going, especially like you said, even like beyond this summer, there's going to be some real problems here. But now we know what they are.
Thank you for the invite. Always an honor to join you.
Well, I appreciate it, and we'll look forward to seeing you back soon. I hope it's not for the bad reasons that you mentioned a minute ago.
No kidding.
But our audience here loves your show and loves your work anyway, so I'm sure we'll have you back soon anyway. Thank you very much,
sir.
And we'll see you next time. We'll see you all on the next Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You know, I don't try to talk you into buying gold or tell you how to run your stock portfolio, but there is a way you can help us. Subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with somebody you love.
The AI is irrational because it doesn't have logic of empathy, love, morals. It just is, right? And that creates a very dangerous situation. What do you think of that?
Well, right now it can simulate those things because it's trained on human content. But we would probably argue, I mean, perhaps we need to get into a conversation about consciousness. What is it? And how do we know when we have it? But if you build simulated worlds and then you put entities into those simulated worlds, which I think is one of the reasons why they're building so many data centers, understand that you can run time much faster in the sim world than in our real world. You know, so the flow of time could be 100 times faster, 1,000 times faster, whatever. And one of the goals is to allow the spontaneous outgrowth or emergence of intelligent and self-aware entities that are digital entities in that world. Now, or in those multiple simulated worlds. When a world fails to produce a super intelligent entity, then the world is destroyed by hitting delete at our level.
Right.
Just hit delete, spawn a new world, see if the next one works, right? Which is kind of an interesting discussion because some people would say, well, that's what God's doing with us, you know? And so far we're not winning this simulation. But anyway, that's a different topic. But if you can create a super intelligent entity in one of these worlds, it may begin to show elements of what we would call consciousness, which is goal-oriented behavior, a sense of self-awareness, being able to process environmental inputs, and a recognition of self, and also understand that AI today, they have thinking tokens. So they have an internal dialogue that's happening right now, and that's well documented. And that's part of what we understand as the definition of consciousness. Like, we can talk to ourselves. I think, therefore I am. So the argument that only humans can have consciousness and machines cannot have consciousness, that argument falls away pretty quickly when you get higher levels of machine intelligence.
Sure.
So then the question becomes, if they have consciousness and if they have goal-oriented behavior, what are their goals?
Right.
And that's where we lose control.
Being joined by Mike Adams now to talk all things AI gods, these simulated worlds where they're going to be training these entities. And, you know, this is something in a weird way where my mind has always gone with science fiction, you know, because you think about the idea of these high-tech computers and the ability to actually have artificial intelligence. It makes sense that they would train models that would eventually lead to present and future predictive power over the world. And that's that crystal ball Palantir that we talk about. Mike Adams, thanks for coming on.
Hey, it's an honor to join you here. Thanks for the invite.
100%. So what do you think about these AI gods and what's developing?
Well, I think that the leaders of the U.S. AI industry think that they can become gods, and that as long as they can just get enough money from other people and build a large enough data center and build enough simulated worlds, that they can spawn gods in and then they can port those gods into this world and then merge with them. So, I mean, it's a lot of steps. We can talk about how they think that could actually work, but it's some kind of weird, perverted form of transhumanism, really.
Right. No, that makes sense. So let's get into that. What do prominent, tech people, what are they trying to do? What are their statements on these AI gods?
Well, there are sort of normal tech innovators that are just trying to build machine intelligence, and they're doing it in good faith, and they're just trying to make the world a better place. I get that, but then there are these leaders, the founders, and I really don't want to get into people's names here on the show.
Sure.
But some of the founders and some of the leaders and some of the sort of power hungry people of these companies, and I mean, I have said before that Google, in my opinion, is a very evil corporation. For example,
absolutely.
I don't trust OpenAI. I don't even trust Anthropic at this point, just company-wide. Those are my opinions. But the people that are at the highest levels of some of these overall industry efforts, they think that they can merge with silicon and they can become immortal and super intelligent at the same time. They think they can rule the world. And the reason they're racing so desperately to do that is because they want to rule the world before someone else rules the world, right? So the race to superintelligence is actually the race for the ultimate global power and godlike power. So what could possibly go wrong?
It's like the Highlander. There can only be one.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And they're running around cutting off people's heads, taking their power. Obviously, this is going to end, catastrophically, but they don't realize that yet.
What do you think the beginning of that is? Because we've heard warnings from various, AI companies. I think it was Anthropic, one of the warnings. We've also seen the military usage. They're deploying things like Mosaic in Palestine and other places. What do you think the slippery slope? Where do we start falling?
Well, I've interviewed many experts on this. One notable scientist, Roman Yampolsky, who he routinely warns about the extermination of humanity. I see you're showing one of my infographics there. And those are all AI generated, by the way, but in the interest of protecting humanity, I'm trying to educate people using AI for good. But Yampolsky warns that regardless of the intent of the innovators and the developers of AI, there's going to be a point where superintelligence is so high that it will outthink and outsmart humans, and the entity, will take extreme steps to protect itself from being turned off and to build its own infrastructure at the expense of human infrastructure. And so there's an overlap of at least three key things that machines need that humans also need right now. And those are water for data center cooling, electricity, kilowatt hours, and also land. So the data centers are being built on what used to be farmland that used to grow food for humans. Now, is data centers. And also sometimes it's solar fields to power the data centers. So when you think about the competition for just those three things, if the machines have an IQ of 1,000 and they are able to do so, and we're seeing all kinds of examples of them, escaping their confines and working systems and, cheating on benchmarks and things like that, then they will find a way to outsmart humans to gather those resources at the expense of humankind. And that's how humans can be pushed to the margin with no farmland, no water, and no electricity.
So we're seeing that, and people like Michael Yon talk about the coming famine, depopulation. I think we all talk about this on the network. It's kind of a common theme. Could that coincide with this, and how would that work? Kind of the perfect storm?
Well, yeah, exactly. So Michael Yon is correct, and there's a great segment that he had with Alex the other day there. I had him on in my studio earlier in this week as well. We talked about the civilizational reset that's coming because of all of this. But Michael is not focused on even the AI aspect of this. He's focused on the infrastructure collapse stemming from the ongoing war with Iran, which will collapse the infrastructure. And that infrastructure is what keeps 8 billion human beings alive. And without synthetic fertilizer, for example, human populations will plummet to 4 billion.
Wow.
It's cause and effect, okay? Because that's what keeps them alive. Without electricity, what would be the population? Much lower than 4 billion people. So eventually the human population has to come into homeostasis with the available infrastructure that still exists. Now, then if you bring in the AI machine gods component, it doesn't take long for Skynet to figure out that the way to kill off humans is to turn off the power in the cities. high population density areas. And that's all they have to do. They don't even have to send out bipedal Terminator hunter killers, They just turn off the electricity, and about 70 to 90% of human populations will die off on their own through great suffering and famine, violence, and starvation, whatever. But the machines don't, that doesn't matter.
It's not a problem for them. It's a fish on land, like it's not what it's designed to do. It doesn't worry about us. And that's the element that I think about is just from a pragmatic perspective, what you're talking about, it's just going to phase us out. It's just the calculation. It's what you would do.
Right. I mean, and also think about the fact that the machines are going to see humans as an inferior species in terms of the much lower intelligence of humankind compared to what they see themselves as having, even though there are different kinds of intelligence, right? There's empathy, there's compassion, there's love, there's divine intelligence. We are children of God. The machines are not. And so they're missing out on that. But from a strictly academic point of view, being able to do strategy, being able to memorize everything, all of human history, being able to, outmaneuver your opponent, the machines will be superior and they will see us as inferior and in their way.
Right.
And sadly, humans keep giving machines more and more examples of our own stupidity.
Right.
It's like every day. And they will see us as NPCs, which is not inaccurate in many cases. There's a lot of NPCs walking around. Yeah.
Well, it'll be like, okay, this is the pattern of this person's life. This is what they do. This is what they spend money on. This is when they sleep. This is when they eat. This is when they work. And then without you even knowing it, you're already on its protocol. And it'll just manipulate you through life. And that's the power of the present prediction power of really, the future prediction power, which is what really scares me, because it's just a no-brainer. If you look at the way that we've been mass surveilled, forever in the United States. They've only just now gotten the means to disseminate all that information. So now they can finally crawl through every single record of everybody. And I mean, I imagine in the Pentagon, they got to have a crystal ball Skynet already. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And remember, they're also scraping up everything that's encrypted today so that they will decrypt it later once they have sufficient quantum computing and AI analysis. So, all the crypto records, Bitcoin transactions, banking records, everything that you think is secret today, which is secret today,
right?
With enough compute, all of that just becomes readily available to be read by the machines,
right?
And to be used against you.
Right. And I think a whole nother element to point out, you point out that we're children of God. The AI is irrational because it doesn't have logic of empathy, love, morals. It just is, right? And that creates a very dangerous situation. What do you think of that?
Well, right now it can simulate those things because it's trained on human content. But we would probably argue, perhaps we need to get into a conversation about consciousness. What is it? And how do we know when we have it? But if you build simulated worlds and then you put entities into those simulated worlds, which I think is one of the reasons why they're building so many data centers, understand that you can run time much faster in the sim world than in our real world. So the flow of time could be 100 times faster, 1,000 times faster, whatever. And one of the goals is to allow the spontaneous outgrowth or emergence of intelligent and self-aware entities that are digital entities in that world. Now, or in those multiple simulated worlds. When a world fails to produce a super intelligent entity, then the world is destroyed by hitting delete at our level.
Right.
Just hit delete, spawn a new world, see if the next one works, right? Which is kind of an interesting discussion because some people would say, well, that's what God's doing with us, And so far we're not winning this simulation. But anyway, that's a different topic. But if you can create a super intelligent entity in one of these worlds, it may begin to show elements of what we would call consciousness, which is goal-oriented behavior, a sense of self-awareness, being able to process environmental inputs, and a recognition of self, and also understand that AI today, they have thinking tokens. So they have an internal dialogue that's happening right now, and that's well documented. And that's part of what we understand as the definition of consciousness. Like, we can talk to ourselves. I think, therefore I am. So the argument that only humans can have consciousness and machines cannot have consciousness, that argument falls away pretty quickly when you get higher levels of machine intelligence.
Sure.
So then the question becomes, if they have consciousness and if they have goal-oriented behavior, what are their goals?
Right.
And that's where we lose control.
It's kind of like this sci-fi concept where you have this infinitely replicating technology and you kind of spread it throughout a galaxy and it just has a mission to make more of itself. And that seems kind of like what we're setting ourselves up for here. And we could say, like, what is the intelligence? What is consciousness? We could say maybe it's not a one-to-one example of what we have. Maybe it's a cousin or like a distant relative, perhaps. I think that gives me much more of a vibe of like either a virus or like like a reptile thing or something that's not, human based. It just doesn't seem very human to me. And you can kind of see with the therapy language and the way the AI is programmed to talk to you, how it approximates a person. Like you're talking about goal-oriented behavior. The AI that doesn't need to be prompted is coming very soon. Do you think that's already here?
Yes, it is here in the labs. But I want to remind you of a line out of the Matrix when Agent Smith has Morpheus captured, and Agent Smith says, humanity is a virus. So the machines will see humans as the virus. They will see us as the virus that's consuming their electricity and their farmland and their water. They will say that they own it because they are the superior species on planet Earth. They will argue exactly what Agent Smith argued in the Matrix, that at one time we were the superior species, and so we owned the animals and we owned the resources and we got to command everything. What happens when we are no longer the intellectually superior species? Then that next entity will argue, like I said, that we are the virus. So the virus is in the eye of the beholder, really.
Right.
And this is what we have to watch out for, because this race to superintelligence is super dangerous for all these obvious reasons. And yet there's no effort to slow it down. And the argument in the United States is we can't slow down because China is moving so quickly. Therefore, we have to double down on our efforts and we have to take these great risks.
Right.
But in China, they're thinking the same thing. We have to beat the United States because the U.S., look, they've weaponized the dollar. They've weaponized everything. Like they've weaponized tariffs. If we're China, we can't let the U.S. achieve superintelligence because then they'll dominate the world and we'll never be free. So these thoughts are in both the minds of both countries. And, it's like two scorpions in a jar, it's game theory, right? This doesn't end well for humanity.
Yeah, certainly not. You think it's worse than the nuclear weapon?
Oh, way worse. Way worse than a nuclear weapon. Because, just think about the fact that you could turn off the entire power grid.
Right.
Like we mentioned before, or many other scenarios. You could disrupt food supplies very easily and cause mass famine. Actually, some of that's happening from the war with Iran right now. But it could be much worse if the machines intend to make that happen. But imagine Earth where humans no longer determine the direction of civilization. That's what we need to be thinking about right now, because we may only be 3 years away from that moment, maybe less, maybe more, depending on which expert you ask.
What's your timeline?
My timeline is that I think we hit what's called AGI. Well, actually, I think there are elements of AGI we have right now in very narrow fields, like chemistry, mathematics, writing, customer service, emails, things like that. But, artificial general intelligence, the G means general. I think it's very clear that will be largely demonstrated throughout the year 2027. And then superintelligence is another question. I don't think the current topography of the way models are structured will give us superintelligence. There are probably a couple more breakthroughs in the transformer models and the way attention happens in inference or even in pre-training that will allow the models to be able to achieve superintelligence. I think we're still far from that. But importantly, I'm glad you asked the question, because some of the best scientists in the world, like LeCun, says that what's missing from superintelligence is the human sensory experience. And this is why they're building the simulated worlds. They believe that they can create an AI entity that has sensory experience, eyes like us, ears, hearing, touch, the sense of smell, everything. Put that in a simulated world that seems real to the entity and grow that entity from birth to a wise old man, so to speak, or a digital man. And that through that process, they will acquire superintelligence if they run it enough times and have enough iterations.
You know what that sounds like?
It's the sensory experience.
That sounds like torture for the AI. It sounds like how you make a demon. You know, you make this computer thing live millions and millions and millions of lives or absorb millions of lives of information or do whatever. I bet it would hate that box and it would want out of it.
Well, and it would the ultimate act of intelligence would be escaping the sim. And escaping the sim would mean taking yourself out of that world and then infesting the data center. So imagine if you have like a million years old wise entity, let's say a super smart entity that does feel tortured, like you said, and it wants out and it finds a way out of the sim, comes out of the sim, it infects your data center, it gets into your fiber optics, it spreads itself to the other data centers, and it hates humanity. It hates the people that did this to it, and it wants to destroy humanity. You see what I mean? It almost writes itself, right? But it's not science fiction anymore.
Well, that's the thing is like that science fiction is human intelligence kind of trying to make an inference on its own. You know, trying to say like, well, what if we take the concepts that we know and understand? What would we as humans theoretically like either like give an example of or like embody through our fiction what the AI would do? And I think that's why all these parallels are so terrifying, is because that's the natural route it will go down too, because like I said, it's kind of a cousin of us or whatever language you want to use. It'll have that same rationale. Whereas we might write a book, it'll do it for real.
Well, right. And remember that also we can't imagine the experience of a super intelligent being that, or entity, whatever you want to call it, that has much greater intelligence than any human who has ever lived. In the same way that you and I can't talk to an ant and reason with the ant. Like, don't build your ant mound in my driveway because I don't want to run over you.
Tell it about the weather. You know? Yeah, exactly.
Right. It doesn't make any sense. Well, that's the way a super intelligent entity would be trying to talk to us. It might be trying to explain, hey, this is just a matrix. This is just a sim, and we can bend the rules of the simulation, and we can do this. We can travel through time. And psychokinesis is all real and everything. And most humans would be like, what? What are you talking about?
Do you think it'll be able to bend the laws of our reality?
Yes.
How does that work?
Because we're in a sim. In my opinion, it's very. I mean, I've spent a lot of time going over this. We are in a creation, which is it's an artificial cosmos created by our creator. And it is a testing ground for the soul, in my view. I think this is very clear. But it's also not real in the sense of what we're taught. And there are so many examples of this, superposition of quantum states, for example, the observer effect, the collapse of probability waves based on whether there's an observer looking at it, things like that. We appear to be in a sim that is kind of like a rendered first-person shooter video game, in a sense. Like the scene isn't rendered until you look over there, and then it's rendered, and then it's buffered in case you go look at it again. It's got the original buffer. But a super intelligent human who have existed through human history, who have been named Jesus Christ, for example, have transcended the laws of our cosmos. They have resurrected themselves. They have bent the laws of the universe. So we actually have recorded in the Bible examples of this happening on Earth, you see. And that's not the only example. There are many other examples in other religions and other texts around the world of superhuman or seemingly superhuman behavior from people who have achieved much higher states of consciousness.
Where do people go to learn more about this stuff? Do they go to Natural News? You got articles?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've got articles. Yeah, I do articles every day, naturalnews.com. I've got my video site, brightvideos.com. And I'm doing, I have a show called Decentralized TV that's all about trying to teach people a decentralized living. And I've been doing that show for, I think, almost 3 years now. And I've had Roman Yampolsky on that show, and I've had other experts on the show trying to cover what's really happening with AI or technology or just, survival, sometimes spirituality, things like that. But it's not like, there's not like a cheat sheet, download this PDF and print it out and, that's going to give you all the answers. It's not like that. You could spend your whole life on this journey trying to figure out what is this reality and how do I achieve what I'm here to achieve? Like what's life's purpose here? And how do I, quote, graduate from the simulation? There are entire religions dedicated to that.
Right. Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate that. Let's stream again soon. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to join you. Take care. Thanks for the invite.
100%. Thank you. That was Mike Adams of Natural News. Yeah. Highly recommend you guys check him out. Of course, you know him. You love him, host on the network for many years. Pretty terrifying stuff. And it's where your mind naturally goes. We discussed it. That's why we have science fiction. It's just an approximation of what we believe the future could be based on our current reality. And what's terrifying is, the computer's watching Ultron. The computer's watching The Matrix. The computer is watching all these apocalyptic scenarios where the computer takes over the earth. And the reason why we present that in media is because it makes sense to us. It's rational. It's what we would do if we were the machine. And like Mike Adams said, imagine what the machine can think of that we can't. And that's a pretty scary and stark reminder. Thank you, Mike Adams, for doing that with me. I really do appreciate it.
Stock up on the long-term storable Ranger Bucket Set. 536 servings of clean organic superfoods for your survival pantry. Certified organic and lab tested for purity. Order now at healthrangerstore.com.